Hi, everyone. My name is Olivia, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. The topic of today's webcast is protecting your organization against zero-day vulnerabilities, sponsored by Manage Engine. Before we begin, of course, I'd love to cover a few quick housekeeping items. Today's webcast is being recorded, so keep an eye out for the link in your email to rewatch the presentation or share with a colleague. Our speaker today, Jay, would be happy to answer your questions, so please go ahead and pop them in the Q&A box throughout today's presentation, and he will follow up with everyone following today's live event. So with that being said, I am so excited to introduce our speaker today, Jay Reddy, Senior Cybersecurity Evangelist at Manage Engine. So we're in for a wonderful event, and with that, I'd love to pass it over to you, Jay. So Jay, take it away.
Thanks a lot for that lovely introduction, Olivia. Thank you so much, guys, for taking the time out to join the webinar today. I'm Jay. I'm a cybersecurity evangelist with Manage Engine. Over the last year and a half, we've been talking on how the landscape has evolved consistently with the whole remote work coming into the picture and how things have taken a turn. Now, through today's webinar, what we want to help you understand is how do you stay ahead of a situation like a zero-day vulnerability? That's the idea behind the webinar. Now, we've understood how attackers are operating, essentially taking advantage of the remote work scenario. We've drawn a few insights. What we want to do is we want to put together a strategy. Now, through the webinar, I would be emphasizing one specific philosophy, which is the zero trust philosophy through and through. What I'll try to do is I'll try and give you tips, insights, and tricks that can essentially help you implement them right after the presentation. Yes, I do understand and agree a lot of you would consider zero trust to be more of a philosophy that works in the long term. Probably a few of you will even have concerns as to implementing it. Indeed, zero trust implementations are difficult. They are time consuming, they are resource consuming. So the idea is we start simple. It is a journey and we want to stay ahead of the attackers. That's the idea. So what I'll do is I'll take a few examples. To be precise, I'll be talking about the Microsoft Hafnium zero-day vulnerability that was exploited. We'll try and unpack the attack. We'll try and learn how the attackers went through exploiting the vulnerability, got into organizations, exfiltrated data. We'll see if we can prepare ourselves to counter if one such zero-day vulnerability were to occur in the future. Now, the trickiest part of a zero-day vulnerability is the fact that you do not know that something of that sort exists till the attackers attack. So that's the trick about zero-day. There's no know-how out there, or there's no standard guide out there that tells you how to go about defending. And in most cases, even trained AI-powered systems or UEBA-powered systems, or in fact, for that matter, your SIEM tools falter because there's no input data to work with. There's no input set from where they can draw insights and then proactively ward off the threat. That's the challenge right here. So we'll try and have practices in place. We'll see if we can put together a disaster recovery strategy. The zero-day vulnerability that we'll be talking about, the one that I pointed out, the Microsoft one, is almost about 4 or 5 months old. But we'll still take inspiration from that because it's relevant even today as we speak. We'll start with the exploits in the Exchange server, the on-prem version. We'll go a little deep into the Proxylogon vulnerability, a specific vulnerability that enable the attackers to pretend to be the administrators and cause all the trouble that they caused. The next part of the session will be where we understand what sort of preventive measures should we be taking against these vulnerabilities if they may be present in your organization. And the last bit, obviously, if you were attacked, we'll see how to figure out if you were attacked. If you patched your systems, great. If you want to still check if there are any backdoors that are persistent in your organization, you can do that through the tutorial that I'm going to show you. And towards the end of the webinar, we'll talk a little bit about disaster recovery and threat mitigation. That's the overall agenda of the session. We'll get started by establishing some timeline right here. So Microsoft put out a notice on the 2nd of March. They went on to notify users about an existing vulnerability, not just one, but 4 vulnerabilities on their on-prem Exchange server. And these vulnerabilities essentially gave an attacker a provision to walk into your exchange without an admin credential, pretend to be the admin credential, pre-authenticate themselves through a proxy bug, pretend to be the administrator again, infiltrate into your organization, get hold of your exchange and emails and whatnot. And also not just that, laterally move to run commands, drop payloads, have web shells in place, and establish a persistent backdoor. That was the idea. That's how they went about exploiting the Proxylogon vulnerability. That was a quick summary. What I'll try to do is I'll try to unpack it in a little depth. Now, is March 2nd the first time Microsoft got to know about the vulnerability and made an announcement? As a matter of fact, no. On the 2nd of March, they in fact came out with the patch that could help organizations fix the existing vulnerability. But then, if you were to trace it back, way back in December of 2020, that's when the Hafnium group started exploiting the vulnerability. That's when initial traces of this exploitation were found. And in January, Velocity, the organization, they had reported trouble with their exchange to Microsoft, and Microsoft started looking into it. They already started working on a patch, and they were scheduled to release on the 9th of March, which is a patch Tuesday. And turned out, before Microsoft could release the patch on the 9th, the Hafnium group somehow, these are state-sponsored cyber terrorists, mind me, these are state-sponsored cyber terrorists who somehow got wind of the whole situation, that that Microsoft is aware of this issue and they're working on a patch, and then they expedited their attack. They went full-blown, all Jason Bourne type. They initiated their attack on somewhere towards the last week of February, and they compromised about 30,000 organizations and their exchange servers. If I were to give you a count on the number of exchange servers that were compromised, it was definitely 100,000 plus exchange servers, mostly in the US. So this was a targeted attack that had targeted government organizations, NGOs, ones that were in the medicine and whatnot, and this did cause a lot of trouble. So on and so forth, that the FBI had to step in a little later, somewhere around the end of March, 25th or 26th of March, the FBI had stepped in. They obtained permission from the federal government to do a full-blown cleanup. They used the same webhook that the attackers had infiltrated, the ones who had infiltrated had used to get into these organizations and to clean up right after the patch was given out. Even when organizations around the world implemented the patch, got the vulnerability fixed, still there were backdoors, and the web shells that were in these organizations were malicious and they were exfiltrating data. So FBI, for the first time, they had gone out of way. This is definitely one of a kind move from FBI that we should take note of. It was that serious. That is the criticality of this specific zero day, where they had to step in. It, in a way, seems as if the FBI had to hack into computers that were already hacked, use the same protocol that the attackers had used to clean up. And then a little later, they had notified the organizations that they had helped clean up. So this is the whole history behind how the attack happened. And why is it this serious is the question that we need to really answer. Now, number one, in most cases, most of the attacks have a specific pattern. We cybersecurity folks call it a cyber kill chain. We have some bit of understanding as to how attackers usually navigate through your systems, be it the accounts that they try to take over, the credentials that they compromise, or the entry points that they usually prefer, or the ports that they try to exploit. We have a set pattern with time we've understood. And in fact, the SIEM tools that we're talking about, or your security tools that we're talking about, take note of this, keep a tab on these blacklisted IPs or blacklisted threat actors and stop them. But then in this case, it was a lot different. The attackers had found out this vulnerability, which was pre-existing. This is a one-of-a-kind case where the complexity of the entire attack, if you were to break it down, it is very simple. Anybody who was aware of the vulnerability can initiate the attack. It was that simple. So existing systems that were supposed to pick up a deviation in behavior or an attack did not pick up. So the low complexity was a problem again, which operated in favor of the attackers. The next one was the attackers did not require any additional privilege. In most attacks, the first step is to compromise a credential, take over an account, laterally move, find the domain administrator, compromise the domain administrator. If it's an Active Directory organization, it would take less than 48 hours to enter an organization with just one credential, take foothold, compromise group policies, compromise groups, find out where the domain admin is. Just basic LDAP queries can give you details of the domain admin, and the rest is just a matter of trial and error. They could brute force, they could password spray, they could do whatnot to find out domain admin credential and take over the privilege. And after which they try to get hold of data, they try to encrypt data, they try to demand a ransom. That's the usual flow. And in this case, they already had the keys to your kingdom. They were able to walk in without triggering any alarm. They did not require any privilege because of an existing bug. They were able to walk in, pretend to be the administrator, do whatever they wanted to. And the last part is the user interaction. Like I told you, they didn't have to take over any accounts at any point in time. A little later, just to expand their foothold after they had got whatever they had got, the access, so to say, they went on to grab a few accounts, but then it was not in most of the cases. They were very good with whatever access that they already had. So user interaction was also not required. So they did not have to socially engineer. They did not have to get hold of service accounts for that matter, or compromise any account for that matter, which did not trigger any alerts in the first place. So it might seem very simple, but there's a lot of brains to it. Now, with just this one vulnerability, they were able to get in and they were able to cause such trouble. And that is the big downside of zero-day vulnerabilities in general. Until they are brought to light, it's difficult to know how exactly are they going to proceed. And in this case, it almost very easily passed right through every radar's nose, every SIEM solution's nose, and they were never detected in the first place. So that is exactly why this attack was dangerous. And the second part of it is where they set their camp. Right after infiltrating into the organization, finding where the vulnerability was, they set their camp. They did what any attacker would do, get long-term access into your system. But then in this case, they were a little smart about it. Since they were already not tipping off any radars, they were very effectively deploying web shells. They were using these web shells to create persistent backdoors. A little later in the webinar today, I'll try and unpack that bit in a little depth. And the last bit, obviously, right after they get hold, right after they get a full-blown two-way access, they are going to try and make use of that to exfiltrate data, the usual course of action. So the first stage, they exploited the Proxylogon vulnerability that was already present. Now, let me probably give you some context on where this Proxylogon vulnerability resides. Now, this attack is only specific to Exchange on-prem. Exchange Online was intact, no problem at all. One good thing about Exchange Online, again, most of you who are considering moving to Exchange Online right now, this would be a great time to do that because Microsoft will be on top of the situation. They manage the servers. They'll be able to patch the systems in case, even if they find out a vulnerability, and it'll be instantaneous. There is not going to be a relapse right there, and they'd be able to do it instantaneous. In this case, with Exchange Online, even after the patch was rolled out, we ran a survey to find out that there were at least 30% of the respondents who were not aware of the memo that Microsoft had sent. So enough damage was already done. So my point of view towards understanding this exploit has come to a juncture where you'll have to consider that you've already been under attack. Your organization security has already been compromised if you were using Exchange Online and you did not patch it for at least, let's say, 2 or 3 days. That is how quickly the Hafnium group worked, and that's how quickly it spread. So when it comes to the architecture of it and which part of the architecture they exploited, it's very surprising that Microsoft did not look into it. So the Exchange server that's running on-prem, a user can access it from their mobile app. They can use their Outlook app. They can use SMTP traditional email, or they could use Outlook web access. They'd be able to access from their mobile browser or their web browser on their desktop or their workstation or where not, and get hold of their emails from the Exchange on-prem client. Now, while this happens, there's an interface. There are a group of servers, not just one server. There are a couple of servers that will work in tandem with each other to form a DAG. The client access services are the ones that usually serve as the front end, and then there are back-end services that do the weightlifting. So when the OWA tries to get a job done, a function or a call done, it has to talk to the backend service. So the client access service has a proxy server that usually validates the request that is incoming. Now, there can be two types of requests. It can be either a non-static request or a static request. In most cases, non-static requests are very specific to the user who's making the request. If I were to put it in plain terms, let's say a user is logging into his or her email, the non-static resources would be the content that's most relevant to the user, maybe their inbox, maybe the folders that update automatically, periodically, real time. So those functions are non-static. They are dynamic, they are real time. So every single time when such a function is accessed, obviously goes without saying there has to be authentication. Ports are opened, the backend services are accessed, but then there's another side of things where it need not be like that. So just for the whole idea of optimizing resource consumption, there are static resources as well, which are defined or predefined, which are common to users. Talk about images, talk about CSS. So OWA being an application contacting exchange, all of these happens through API calls. There are static resources like images and CSS that can be in the cache for a longer time, and it does not really require an authentication because it's not critical in a way. So this is where the problem initiated. This is where there was a logical flaw. So they were able to initiate an SSRF vulnerability exploit right here at this stage, since it used a cookie that looked something like this. Okay, this cookie essentially helped determine the OWA and grant it that free access to static resources. Now, when we're talking about this cookie at a server level, the Exchange server concatenates the last bit of it. So the first bit of it till the FQDN, that's where it validates to see what cookie information it is. And the rest of it, it clips it, checks for authenticity, and then lets the request stray through. Now, this is where the vulnerability lies. And this is the reason for all the problem, because right when it got clipped, the Exchange server failed to see what came after that. Now, this is where the attackers were able to insert their piece of information or their piece of code that got them the admin security token returned. Now, to put it in simple terms, this is what they did. They took this piece of the clipped cookie, they malformed the serialized data, and then they sent across the request, got back an admin security token, and right after that, the rest is history. So the modified request that looks like a static request, which essentially isn't, which has the piece of code from the attacker, gets into your server, the client access services give it a good to go, the backend services are reached, and even before your system is compromised, the attacker is in your system. So this is where they first set foot. Now, right after that, the next bit is pretty easy. Now that they've walked into your system pretending to have admin credential run your backend services, that's all that they need, and everything. They could be multiple flows that they could take. But then the attackers took this specific flow. In Hafnium attack, the Hafnium group specifically took this flow where they got a piece of malware, a web shell to be precise, that gave them unchecked access a little later. Now, these web shells will serve as a direct relay even after the session expires. They did some workaround right here. In general, what happens when a user tries to access a resource, there's an authentication that happens. Right after the authentication, they access it. Right when they're about to wind up their work, the session expires, they log out, or even if they don't, after a specific point in time, the session expires because it's timed like that. To bypass this, to ensure that they have constant access, that's where the web shell came into the picture. So they use this aspect of the web shell to drop it, leave it right there, to use that time to do their reconnaissance. In most cases, even after they got in, it's assumed that they hacked into these servers way back, let's say in the last bit of January, and then they actually initiated the attack, and the exfiltration happened in February, towards the end of February. So they were waiting in a lot of servers. They were already in systems and organizations. They were looking and doing their reconnaissance to find out what's important, because they had a persistent backdoor. Now, this again is the biggest problem right here. These persistent backdoors, even after you fix or you patch, at times they might still exist in your system, which is exactly why Microsoft put out the hash for these web shells. Now you will have to take or make use of these hash codes, have them input into your SIEM solution or your Microsoft Security and Control Center. You can have that input and have red flags or have them removed if these are available, if these piece of codes of these web shells are present in your system. That's how you go about navigating here. So now the attackers have successfully set up a backdoor. The next obvious choice is to have a script that keeps it open. Now, right after this whole process is established, they have a full-blown link to your system. They want to get to actual work. They'd want to start their data thievery or their data exfiltration. So they use the vulnerability for remote code execution. So again, there were 4 vulnerabilities to the whole attack. Another one that they used was the remote code execution vulnerability, which got them to execute a piece of information or a piece of software. In this case, they had done a couple of things. I'll probably walk you through as to what all did they do. Just give me a quick moment right here. There were 4 different things that most of them did. They had the backdoor. They used that to install malware and have data exfiltrated. The resources were already compromised. There were 4 things that they did. Now, proc dump, they had used that to dump any credentials that were already there in the LSAS memory. So this is where they got smart. They used this data to see if they could get hold of any admin credential. Let's say there were domain administrators, all right, from Active Directory or generally with someone with admin privileges. If those accounts were used or did access exchange in this specific time frame when the attackers were already in, they'd be able to extract it through the proc dump. That's exactly what they did. And right after they got out of admin credentials, they could literally move and they could whatnot. Now, another part of the attack was where they had used an existing software or a solution that was already present, which did not trigger any alert. Now, this is again where they got smart. Rather than using any other piece of code, they chose to use applications that were already built into the system. Now, we're talking about WinZip or 7-Zip that will not trigger any alert at all, unless, let's say, there's a user behavior analytics out there that tracks and says, no, this user or administrator had never really initiated a 7-Zip compressed request. Why is he or she doing that right now? If that were the case, then we would have been able to be on top of the situation. That wasn't the case. The attackers used an existing system. Now, this is very off the book. In most cases, attackers, they have their own handmade code. They have their own, custom-made code that they use to do the whole packaging. In this case, they'd used what was already available, what was already at their disposal, which did not trigger any alert. So they were smart about that in that way. And also, they were using PowerShell snap-ins to export mailbox data. That was an obvious move. So they wanted to get hold of any intellectual property, something of value that was there in the organization's mailbox. So the Exchange box was compromised, no doubt about that, and they did not stop right there. Now, I told you that they wanted to have a full-blown, long-lasting connection where they could get onto the system whenever they want, do a remote session or whatnot. So they also went on to download PowerCat. Now, this piece of code, it was very straightforward that it downloaded it from GitHub, had it installed, and set up an open connection to it remote. And this is how that they did. So now, as you go forward, you'll be able to find all of this unpacked. Very simple and very straightforward. Now, these points that I've just mentioned about the proc dump, about the 7-Zip movement, and then about PowerShell snap-ins, and how PowerCat was used to keep a connection open, these can essentially also serve as indicators of compromise. The first indicator of compromise was the one that Microsoft had already put out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a quick second to jump to the announcement that Microsoft had made. It would give you a lot of clarity, so do look at it. So this was when Microsoft first came up with the announcement. They made the announcement way back in March, and they've been updating it since then. Whatever update, whatever change, or whatever tool they've brought together, they keep updating this when there's a movement in this specific attack. The one that we discussed a little earlier today was the SSRF, the server-side request forgery. This was the innate vulnerability that they had exploited to walk in and pretend to be the administrator. With respect to the details of the code, it's available right here. Now, as you go a little forward, you have the indicators of compromises listed right here. So these are the indicators of compromise, the web shells, so to say. You can have them screenshot, or a little later I'll have them shared. And then you have the paths where the ASP got installed. You have all the web shells right here. These are the ones that you can look out for. And then there are other tools that they went on to use. ProcDump was one, and PowerCat was another tool that they'd use. PowerCat, again, is readily available on GitHub. You can read up. They've got instructions as to how it works and all of that. Definitely a good read right here. And you can keep the port open. It lets them keep a standard connection as long as they choose. It's as simple as changing an integer right here. And then Microsoft went on to go above and beyond to put together a tool. So when you search Microsoft Mitigation Tool, you get this link right on top. This is the first link that pops up. So you open this, you've got the tool, how it works, the whole deal, and the literature around how it works. So you've got this and how to implement it. So if you haven't done it yet, if you've just patched it but haven't really checked if any of those vulnerabilities or the backdoors still exist, you can use this one-click tool. And Microsoft Safety Scanner already has this inbuilt, but you can still nevertheless try it out and see if it helps you pick up any of those web shells in your organizations if they still persist. Now, back to these IOCs, so have them as your inputs, and you'll be able to do some bit of mitigation around that. Now, if you find them out, one thing that you can do is obviously use the mitigation tool, but most of us really are panicking at this point in time. So there are obviously two steps right here. There's damage control. If you found out that malicious piece of code is still there, there's damage control that you can go forward with. And if not, then there's obviously mitigation that you can look at as an option. Now, when it comes to what should you be doing, scan for these web shells, see if there are any unusual behaviors, and monitor PowerShell activities. As simple as that, 3 straightforward steps. Now, this is very specific instruction to this zero-day vulnerability. It can change based on what vulnerability we are dealing with, but then it gives you the direction where you should essentially be looking, or as your first response, this is what you do. Now, when it comes to scanning for web shells, I've given you a list of shells right here. The ones again, here you go. So you can have them screenshot. You can look for these. The next part is the unusual user behavior. So right after they've established the control, in few cases what they had done was they had taken over accounts. They had used those privileges to create user accounts, have a few files encrypted, have them sent across. And in fact, in most cases, they take over user accounts in pursuit of having control for a longer period of time. That's the idea. So more the privileged accounts that they compromise, they subtly try to have backdoor accesses, not just through the script, but also through the accounts per se, through an account takeover. So that's what they do. So unusual user behavior is something that you might probably notice. If the admin privileges are being used to encrypt, or if they're being used to send across some data, that's something that you should definitely be on the lookout for. Now, with basic functionalities that are already available in your native tools, will you be able to do it? The simple answer is no. There are difficulties in seeing through this whole bit of activity, seeing if there are any deviations. But then if you can correlate what activities are happening, that's where you really become smart about handling the threat intelligence that you already have. So that's just one bit of it. But then the other bit of it is where the PowerShell comes into the picture. In almost all attacks, there's some level of involvement where they try to execute some PowerShell script to gain control, or with the control that they've gained, execute an action. So shifting through PowerShell logs can be quite intimidating, and at times can be quite tedious too. So you'll need to have some sort of protocol or a way or a tool that can help you correlate, give you insights. That's what we'll be needing. We should be ideally looking at. And then when you go forward, how do you prevent this specific attack? If that's the question that you have in mind, now, easy option is to deploy the patches that you must have already done. The next most important step is restrict authorization to untrusted conditions or connections. Now, this is where zero trust effectively comes in the picture. The problem with the entire attack was the fact that they were able to walk in pre-authenticated. Now, this is a function of trust. Most cases, we consider users inside the organization to be trustworthy, and most of the time they have a lot of privileges. Even while you've been working remotely, you must have noticed a lot of users trying to get hold of additional privileges more than what they required. Users love hoarding privileges. They'd end up hoarding so much that half of which they'd not even use. So keeping a track of what privileges were given to users, again, is a big problem. So doing the whole privilege management through a zero trust angle is definitely something you should consider. So when I say zero trust, there are two things that you can do. These are Microsoft recommendations again. Now, Microsoft has gone above and beyond very many times to do what best they can do. Now, in fact, they have a 288-page long security hardening guide for Active Directory and Exchange, but how many of us have read it? So the question is pretty simple. I'm very sure the attackers went through the manual end to end. They know it by heart. But when it comes to us, at times it's difficult for us to consume such literature, not easy. So that's exactly where attackers try to take advantage. So the easier way out is going to be doing it ground up. If you can do it zero trust way, if you can just do just in time and only on demand do you trust a user. So every single time when a request comes in, irrespective of where the request comes in, who the request comes from, you authorize and authenticate. You check if they are who they claim to be. You can do a lot of things around authentication right here. You cannot just stop with basic password-based authentication. You can be a little creative right here and have MFA for your applications. Now, this might sound a little daunting or tedious, but then turns out your users can adapt or adopt MFA much sooner than you think, because they use it day in, day out for their Facebook and Google logins. They have MFA everywhere. And with Microsoft Authenticator, mobile authenticator, you can make it all the more easier. So restricting authorization of untrusted connection is again a very big part mitigating this potential vulnerability, or any other for that matter, because it's foundation to zero trust. So try that out, that piece. If you have a dashboard right now, if you also have, let's say, Office 365 or you have Security Center, you'd be able to check your risk score again. MFA always gets you a great risk score when it comes to, makes your risk score much better looking when it comes to the secure score dashboard. You would have access to the secure score dashboard. You can very much check that out. Now, going forward, it's important that we understand it's not just user behavior. It's not just monitoring PowerShell scripts or web shells, but also how do you go about deleting these web shells ASAP? How do you de-escalate the privileges that the attackers have taken over? And if there were any malicious activities performed with the PowerShell access itself, how do you identify that and you reverse that? So these are the questions that you should ask. But is this enough damage control? The answer is no. With just this, it doesn't get over. You have troubles because deploying patches again at times can get a little tedious with all your users working remotely. And again, even if it were done on time, there's no guarantee that you are 100% immune to a future threat of this sort. Or what about the backdoors that are existing? Shifting through PowerShell logs is going to be troublesome. How do you keep a tab of who's got what? Now, very many times, privilege escalations or privilege creep, as we call, happens because users hoard it. It's very laborious to find out who's got these privileges. Auditing, again, is a big trouble all by itself. But how do you not just audit, but also have that implemented right back in? So it is a vicious cycle as we go about handling privileges for users. And then obviously, with the way how these attackers approached this whole attack, they were low key. They used the existing systems in Microsoft to do their encryption, or like zipping for that matter, and packaging and then having it sent back. So they were not detected using your existing systems. And that's where a proactive, zero trust based automated approach can come into the picture. Now, that's a lot of words, but then if I break it down, it's very simple. You'll have to have a threat detection system that doesn't just detect a deviation in behavior, but also can automatically respond. Now, here, time is the essence for success. So if you can have your incident response configured to not just analyze user behavior, but also analyze entity behavior, it would be of great help. We'll talk about it a little later now. Now, there's also a provision to go through your logs. If you have a smart search or Elasticsearch for your logs, even better. If there's monitoring of network traffic and if you can block malicious IP, that's a great place to start. In most cases, what we've observed is in the last year and a half, organizations have inadvertently exposed their internal applications. At least 40% of their internal applications are now internet facing. Now, how scary is that? Microsoft OWA was meant to be internet facing, connecting to Exchange Online. It had a vulnerability and the exploit was very bad. There are many internal applications out there in your organization that were never really meant to be internet facing, but for the want of connectivity, for the want of access, you've made them internet facing right now. I'm pretty sure a lot of you agree. Now, if it were unchecked, a basic port scan with a tool out there can easily get them to find where the vulnerability lies and how could they crack right through in. Now, that's exactly where you'll need to look at VPN as an option. Can you have VPN, or can you have a second factor even for those applications as we speak? Now, entity behavior analytics can really do the job for you, so we'll talk a little bit about that too. Now, when it comes to threat detection, like I said, time is crucial. If you can incorporate real-time data, so right when an announcement of this sort is made by Microsoft, if you can have a system that'll do the job for you of implementing the patch all by itself, or deploying the patches remotely, or protecting, in fact, even like for that matter, like going through your entire organization's repository of resources to find out if these web shells exist, maybe even delete them for you. That is the sort of automated incident response that you should be looking out. There are tools out there that does all of these in real time. Now, Managed Engine comes in the picture right here. We do full-blown correlation of logs. We try to make our interpretations about what's going wrong. When it comes to the tool, it has real-time integration with threat intelligence feeds like WebRoot. We try to stay on top of the situation, give you alerts if something's wrong. We help you do an automated incident response, or it could be triggered incident response too. And on top of it, if there are any critical changes of these sorts that are happening to your critical resources, you would be notified right away. You would be able to use an incident workflow. You would be not just be able to do that, you can use the UEBA bit of the Managed Engine offering right here to get the job done. Now, through and through, it doesn't really just stop with identifying them, detecting them, preventing them, or even mitigating them. You should also have a full-blown process in place to see if you can do a forensic analysis. Now, most cases, since organizations, as I speak to them, have been infected and they got to it a little late, now forensic analysis can be of great help in figuring out these IOCs that are persistent in your systems and closing all these backdoors wherever they exist. I, in fact, heard a really wild suggestion where an organization went out to the extent completely having their Exchange offline wiped out and they rebuilt it from scratch online. So people go to such extents, but then that wouldn't be, that's definitely a stretch, but then you can really look at migrating to online. That's something that you can consider right now. At the outset of it, it might look a little more expensive than on-prem Exchange, but then the cost-benefit ratio, if you analyze in the long term with the service that they offer, with the patch deployment, which is definitely man-hours for us, which is stressful for us, which is time-consuming for us, a lot of effort, considering all of that, in the long run, Exchange Online might work. And in this case, too, in the Half-Name attack, too, it did work. The attack was only on Exchange on-prem, so you can look at that as well. So through and through, we'll have to understand that there's more to it. There were many levels at which the attack could have been potentially mitigated. Now, starting at the level where they got into the organization pre-authenticated, you would have been able to detect a malicious entrant with a malicious intent who had never really stepped in the organization with UBA and user behavior analytics. With privilege escalation that they had done, you'd be able to find out if there are any new privileges given to a new user or an existing privileged user using the privilege for something that they had never used before. Now, that again could be a UBA case, an entity and behavior case. Now, not just that, we're also talking about critical data being zipped. This is what they had done, right? They had zipped files and folders. Now, if that had happened in bulk, the DLP module, the data leak and loss prevention module of a tool of this sort can help you get notified and, in fact, stop that from propagating any further right when it starts. So that's one stage where you could have stepped in. Or at the last bit, when they were using the write function to write malicious code and send back, you would have been able to determine that as well with a tool like Log360. So the idea is, do look out for options. If you're looking at them, machine learning is something, machine learning powered UBA is a feature that you should be looking out for. And then through and through, if the incident response can be automated, the threat detection can be real time, and it also has event correlation. That's the sort of tool that you should be really eyeing at. Now, once all of this is done, obviously you tend to be more compliant than before. That's the idea with which you will want to go forward. So what I'll do right now is I'll give you a quick recap on what all have we discussed about a zero-day attack and what could you do. So before the attack happens, that's a phase. After the attack happens, again, that's obviously a phase. So we'll talk about before the attack, just giving you a recap. You will need visibility and understanding into your environment, where your systems are, what ports are open, scan through all of them, who are your users, where are your loose ends. In most cases, most zero-day vulnerabilities take advantage of your user aspect of it, which is the weakest link in your security chain. So you'd need to consider that as well. Do you have a defined emergency response team? Now, that again is a big question that you should ask yourself, because time again is critical. If you had a defined emergency response team, someone who can look into it right away, the damage can definitely be contained, if not absolutely mitigated. Now we're talking about also putting together a remediation plan. Now, historically, we have seen many attacks. We understand in most cases how they operate. We understand their kill chain too. So if you can have a remediation plan, what would you do and what would you safeguard at this critical time? That would be much better. And all of this has to be DR focused, which is disaster recovery focused, and have your backups in place, no doubt. Now, this is before the attack happens. How do you proactively be safe? And obviously, it goes without saying, if you take the zero trust approach, you'd be a lot more secure. Very many checkboxes that I just pointed out are already checked. And after the attack, now if something of this sort happens, you start with deploying patches. You do all the updates that are necessary, but then it's definitely temporary mitigation. What you should do is you should investigate the IOCs. Now, the IOCs in this case are already available. Why are we bringing up this Microsoft topic or Half-Yum topic? It's still relevant. There are organizations who are still being attacked post the whole thing till date. There are follow-up ransomwares that are infecting organizations. In fact, the governments are still figuring out who Half-Yum is, who are they backed by, what's the whole case with this specific group of cyber terrorists. And even like a week back, the UK had made an announcement, and it keeps going on. It's still being unraveled, and that's the nature of attacks of these sorts. And as we go forward, besides just the indicators of compromise, you need to know where all things could have gone wrong. Obviously, the attacker would have harvested credentials. That's something that they definitely do. They'd not step out of your organization without doing that. So a mandatory organization-wide password reset is something that I definitely suggest. Now, besides that, there are going to be privilege escalations that are obvious. So you can look at logs to see if there are any new accounts that have gotten additional privileges. You can use UBA right there. They're going to have persistent backdoors in place, so the web shells have to be removed. They're going to try and move laterally. Again, if there are any dubious behavior, probably at a non-business hour, initiated from a device that's not known to you, from an IP address that's not known to you, a geographic location that's not known to you, UBA can come into the picture to save the day. And as you go about doing this, there's also remediation. You'd want to clean and restore your affected system, reset your admin credentials. That's how you go about handling a zero-day vulnerability. There's how much we could do, but then it's quite realistic when you take a calculated approach. You guys have been lovely. Thank you so much for having taken the time. I'd be answering your questions over email. My email ID is on the screen. You've been a lovely audience. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jay. That was fantastic. We really appreciate you taking some time to be with us today. And with that, I do want to remind our audience to go ahead and put your questions right in the Q&A box, and Jay will be able to follow up with you individually. But with that, thank you everyone for attending today's webcast, and thank you again, Jay, for spending some time with us to share some really great information. We hope you all have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you on the next one.